Emily Carter sat on the edge of her bed in her freezing Chicago apartment, the rhythmic clink of coins hitting glass echoing through the empty room. She tipped the jar over, watching a pathetic waterfall of pennies and nickels spill onto the worn mattress. She didn't need to count them again. She knew the truth. She was exactly $142 short for the electricity bill, and her mother's latest hospital invoice sat on the nightstand like a death warrant. Emily exhaled, her breath blooming in a thick, white cloud in the unheated air. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, violent purple. Wind lashed against the brick building with the force of an angry giant, and rain pounded the glass so hard she feared it might shatter. Chicago was drowning in the worst storm of the decade. Emily stood up, her joints stiff from the cold, and walked to the kitchen. She pulled open the cabinet to find it nearly bare, a half-empty box of generic pasta and a single jar of peanut butter. Her stomach twisted with the hollow ache she had lived with for months, but she ignored it. She had to. 2 years of pre-med, 3 part-time jobs, and 18-hour days, none of it mattered. The medical debts from her mother's heart surgery were a mountain she couldn't climb, no matter how hard she clawed. She had sold her car, her textbooks, and finally, the small gold locket her mother had given her for graduation. She was out of things to sell. She was out of time. She looked at the door, half expecting an eviction notice to slide under it at any moment. She curled up on the couch, shivering under a thin, pilled blanket, trying to study by the weak light of a flickering lamp. She had too much pride to ask the university for help, and too much fear to admit she was failing. "Just keep going," she whispered to the empty room. "Just survive tonight." Then a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the apartment. Emily froze. It was nearly midnight. No one came to this part of the South Side at this hour unless they were looking for trouble. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crept toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Through the peephole, she saw a shadow that made her blood run cold. A man stood there, towering and broad-shouldered, his white shirt soaked through and clinging to a frame built like a weapon. Dirt and grease smeared his face, and a jagged scar cut across his cheek. Even through the distorted lens, she could see the dark ink of a tattoo snaking up his neck. He looked like a man who had crawled out of a war zone, dangerous, desperate, and rough. But then he shifted, and Emily's breath hitched. In his powerful arms, he was cradling a frail, elderly woman wrapped in a tattered wool coat. Her eyes were closed, her face a terrifying shade of gray. Every instinct Emily had honed in her medical classes screamed danger, but her heart saw the woman's shallow, rattling breath. The man's jaw was tight, his eyes, sharp as shards of ice, were filled with a raw, silent plea she hadn't expected from someone who looked so formidable. Emily's hand tightened on the lock. Her brain yelled at her to stay inside, to stay safe, but her soul wouldn't let her. She turned the deadbolt, the cold wind instantly slamming the door open against her. The stranger didn't move toward her like a predator. He simply looked at her, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely rose above the roar of the rain. "Please," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "She can't breathe. We have nowhere else to go." Emily looked at the homeless man, unaware that the hand she was about to reach out would change the fate of the entire city. She stepped aside, letting the storm and Lorenzo DeLuca into her life. Lorenzo moved into the small apartment like a tidal wave held in check by sheer will. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he carefully laid Giovanna onto Emily's frayed, lumpy couch. Emily didn't hesitate. The sight of the elderly woman's blue-tinged lips and the frightening whistle of her breath silenced the alarm bells ringing in her head about the man's scarred face and blood-stained shirt. "She's in respiratory distress," Emily said, her voice snapping into a professional clip that surprised even her. She hurried to the kitchen, grabbing her small medical kit and a bowl of warm water. Lorenzo stood back, his massive frame making the tiny room feel like a birdcage. His eyes, sharp as knives, never left Emily's hands. Do you know what you're doing? He rasped, his jaw so tight it looked like it might crack. I'm a pre-med student with 3 years of clinical volunteering, she replied, not looking up as she gently tilted Giovanna's head to clear her airway. If I don't stabilize her, she won't make it to the morning, and the storm is too bad for an ambulance to get here in time. Lorenzo went silent. He watched as Emily used a makeshift nebulizer she'd kept from her mother's previous treatments. She moved with a grace that defied the poverty of her surroundings. For 3 hours, she didn't sit down. She monitored Giovanna's pulse, wiped the sweat from the old woman's brow, and whispered words of comfort that seemed to soothe the patient even in her semi-conscious state. As the immediate crisis passed and Giovanna's breathing leveled out into a peaceful sleep, the tension in the room shifted. Emily finally sat back on her heels, her knees aching. She looked up and caught Lorenzo staring at her, not with the aggression of a street thug, but with a profound, unsettled wonder. Why? He asked suddenly. His voice was lower now, stripped of its edge. You don't know us. I look like a man you should have called the police on. Emily looked at his torn shirt and the dirt-streaked tattoo on his neck, then at the peaceful expression on Giovanna's face. My mother is in a hospital bed 10 miles away, she said softly, her pride finally giving way to exhaustion. I know what it's like to pray for a miracle and get nothing but silence. I couldn't be the silence for you. Lorenzo reached out as if to touch her shoulder, then pulled back, his hand trembling slightly, a motion blur of hesitation. He didn't thank her with words. He simply sat in the hard wooden chair across from her, a dark sentinel watching over the girl who had just saved the only person he loved in a world that usually only offered him betrayal. The apartment remained a fragile bubble of warmth against the relentless Chicago gale. Giovanna's breathing had finally steadied, her frail form tucked deeply into the only clean sheets Emily possessed. As the adrenaline of the medical crisis ebbed, it left behind a hollow, gnawing ache in Emily's stomach, a reminder of the meal she had been trying to talk herself out of eating all night. She moved quietly into the kitchen, her shadow stretching long and thin under the flickering yellow light. Behind her, she felt the heavy, silent weight of Lorenzo's gaze. He hadn't moved from the wooden chair, sitting with a predatory stillness that made the air feel thick. Emily reached into the back of the cupboard and pulled down a single, dented tin of tomato soup. It was the last one. With steady hands, she opened the can and emptied it into a small pot, the sound of the gas burner hissing to life the only noise in the room. She sliced the heel of a loaf of bread dry and white and laid it on a chipped plate. When the soup was hot, she poured it into 2 small bowls, though the portions were meager. She carried the tray back to the small table and pushed the larger bowl toward Lorenzo. It isn't much, she whispered, her voice rasping with exhaustion. But you need to eat. You've been out in that storm for hours. Lorenzo looked at the bowl, then back at the open cabinet Emily had forgotten to close. His eyes, keen as knives, took in the empty shelves, the single jar of peanut butter, and the way Emily's hand shook slightly as she picked up her own spoon. He didn't touch the food immediately. The silence stretched, heavy and knowing. You're giving us your last meal, he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low rumble, stripped of its earlier aggression and replaced by a dark, simmering intensity. Emily forced a small, tired smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I've learned to survive on less, she lied, her pride flaring up like a dying ember. Please. If you don't eat, you won't be able to look after her. Lorenzo picked up the spoon, his knuckles whitening. He ate in silence, but his attention never wavered from her. He watched the way she sipped her soup slowly, trying to make it last, and the way she checked on his mother every few minutes with a tenderness that money couldn't buy. In the dim, warm light of the apartment, Lorenzo DeLuca, a man who owned half the city and trusted no one, realized he was sitting across from the only honest heart he had ever encountered. He looked at the torn sleeve of his shirt and the blood on his cuff, then at the girl who had nothing but was giving him everything, and for the first time in years, The icy steel in his gaze flickered. The first rays of a gray, rain-washed dawn crept through the thin curtains of the apartment, pulling Emily from a shallow, seated sleep. She jolted awake, her neck stiff and her heart racing with the sudden memory of the night's visitors. She turned immediately toward the couch, her breath held in anticipation of checking Giovanna's vitals once more, but her heart nearly stopped for a different reason. The couch was empty. The thin, pilled blanket Emily had used to cover the elderly woman was folded with military precision at the foot of the cushions. There was no trace of the shivering woman or the massive, scarred man who had sat like a sentinel in her kitchen. The apartment was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant drip of rain from the eaves and the hum of the refrigerator. Emily stood up, her legs feeling like lead, and rushed to the window. Below, on the rain-slicked Chicago street, she caught the fleeting reflection of a sleek, black vehicle disappearing around the corner, an armored silhouette that looked entirely out of place in her crumbling neighborhood. It was a ghost of the storm, leaving her to wonder if the entire night had been a fever dream brought on by hunger and exhaustion. She turned back to the small kitchen table, her eyes landing on the spot where Lorenzo had sat. The empty soup bowl was gone, washed and drying in the rack, but in its place sat a small, heavy object. Emily approached it slowly, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Tucked under the edge of a plain white business card was a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. Her hands shook as she picked up the money. She didn't need to count it to know it was more than she had earned in the last year. It was exactly $5,000. It was her rent, her mother's medicine, and the electricity bill that had been haunting her dreams, all delivered by a man she had fed from a dented tin. She turned the business card over in her palm. It was stark white, devoid of a company name or a title. In the center, printed in elegant, raised black ink, was a single string of digits and a name that carried the weight of the city, Lorenzo DeLuca. Emily sank into the chair, the weight of the cash heavy in her lap. The homeless man was gone, but the shadow he left behind was far larger than the one that had stood in her doorway. She had opened her door to a stranger in a storm, and in return, the man who owned half the city had just handed her a lifeline and a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. The following week was a blur of survival and disbelief. Emily had used the money with a surgical precision that felt almost sinful, paying off the electricity, the back rent, and her mother's most urgent prescriptions. Yet, despite the sudden warmth in her apartment, a cold dread settled in her chest every time she looked at the white business card tucked into her textbook. She was sitting in the back of the university library, the blue light of her laptop screen reflecting in her tired eyes, when a notification pinged on her phone. It was a news alert from the Chicago Tribune. Manhunt intensifies. Lorenzo DeLuca survives assassination attempt in South Side storm. Emily's breath caught. She clicked the link, her hands beginning to shake. A grainy, long-distance photo appeared on the screen. It showed a man in a charcoal suit, surrounded by stone-faced guards outside a courthouse. Even through the pixels, she recognized the lethal set of his jaw and the terrifying intensity of his gaze. It was him. The article described a ghost of the underworld, a man who allegedly owned the docks, the skyscrapers, and half the politicians in the city. He was the head of the DeLuca syndicate, a name spoken in whispers. The homeless man who had sat in her kitchen and eaten her last can of tomato soup was the most feared man in Illinois. The report mentioned a high-speed ambush 6 blocks from her apartment on the night of the storm. His car had been riddled with bullets, his driver hospitalized. He had vanished into the rain, carrying his mother to safety while his enemies hunted him through the dark. Emily leaned back, the air in the library suddenly feeling too thin. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had wiped the brow of a mafia queen and served a meal to a monster. She realized now why he had watched her with such bewilderment. In a city where everyone was either trying to kill him or buy him, she had simply seen a man in need. Her phone vibrated in her lap. It was an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat, then thundered. She answered with a trembling voice, "Hello." "Miss Carter," a deep, familiar rasp came through the line. It wasn't Lorenzo. It was the voice of the man who had driven the black SUV. "Marcus. Mr. DeLuca has a job opportunity he thinks you'll be interested in. A car is waiting outside your library. Now." Emily looked toward the glass doors. A sleek, black sedan sat idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the gray Chicago sky. The $5,000 had been a thank you. This was something else. This was an invitation into the lion's den. The sleek black sedan felt like a pressurized capsule, isolating Emily from the familiar grit of the Chicago streets as Marcus steered toward the hospital. She clutched her bag to her chest, the weight of the mystery caller's command still echoing in her ears. She expected to be taken to a warehouse or a hidden estate, but when the car pulled into the familiar circular drive of the medical center where her mother was a patient, Emily's confusion only deepened. Marcus didn't speak. He simply opened her door and gestured toward the billing department with a silent, sharp nod. Emily walked through the sliding glass doors, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had spent the last 6 months dreading this desk, practicing her pleas for extensions and payment plans that never felt like enough. When she reached the window, the clerk looked up, but the usual mask of professional coldness was gone, replaced by a look of bewildered awe. "Miss Carter," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "We've been trying to reach you. There's been a significant update to your account." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. "I have the $500 from the trust," she began, her voice small, her pride already bracing for the inevitable rejection. "I know it's not enough, but—" "Miss Carter, you don't understand," the clerk interrupted, turning her computer screen so Emily could see the digital ledger. Emily stared at the screen, her eyes blurring. The long, terrifying string of red numbers, the $84,000 balance that had been a literal weight on her soul, was gone. In its place was a single word printed in bold, clinical black: paid. Below it, the source was listed simply as the DeLuca Foundation. "It's not just the past bills," the clerk whispered, leaning in closer. "An endowment was set up this morning. Your mother's entire course of treatment, her upcoming surgery, and her private recovery suite, it's all been covered in full. It's a miracle." Emily stepped back, her knees nearly giving out. This wasn't just a thank you for a bowl of soup. This was the king of the city reaching down to erase her greatest fear. She turned and saw Marcus standing by the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't looking at her, but he was waiting. She realized then that the $5,000 in her drawer was just a drop of rain in Lorenzo's ocean. He didn't just want to repay a debt. He was showing her the sheer scale of the world he inhabited. As she walked back toward the car, she knew she couldn't just walk away now. A miracle of this size didn't come without a price, and Lorenzo DeLuca was finally ready to collect. The transformation of Emily's world was no longer a series of quiet miracles. It became an undeniable, thunderous reality. As she stepped out of the hospital, the gray Chicago afternoon was split by the glare of polished chrome and the low, synchronized hum of idling engines. A line of 5 identical, obsidian black SUVs sat waiting at the curb, their tinted windows acting as mirrors for the crumbling brick of the neighborhood they were about to leave behind. Passers-by slowed their pace, their faces a mix of awe and instinctual fear, recognizing the silent language of absolute power. Marcus held the door open for her with a stiff, professional courtesy that felt more like a summons than an invitation. As Emily slid into the leather interior, the city outside was replaced by a heavy, velvet silence. The motorcade moved as one, a sleek predator cutting through the congested veins of the city, ignoring traffic lights as if the laws of the road were merely suggestions for lesser people. Emily watched the transition through the glass. The cracked sidewalks of her youth gave way to the manicured plazas and towering glass monoliths of the Loop. This was the city Lorenzo DeLuca owned, a world of high-stakes shadows where he moved unseen, yet felt by everyone. The cars pulled into the private, subterranean entrance of the DeLuca Tower, a spire of steel that seemed to pierce the very clouds. Emily was led toward a private elevator, the ascent so smooth and rapid it made her ears pop and her stomach drop. When the doors finally hissed open, she was standing in a sprawling penthouse that spanned the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the lake, the water turning a dark, bruised navy in the fading light. Lorenzo was standing at the far end of the room, his back to her. He had shed the homeless disguise entirely. He now wore a charcoal three-piece suit that fit his broad shoulders with lethal precision. The rough vagabond was gone, replaced by the reclusive king of the Chicago underworld. He didn't turn around immediately, his gaze fixed on the sprawling grid of lights below. "You saved her life in a room that didn't have enough heat to keep a candle lit," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that filled the vast space. "Most people in this city want something from me. You gave me the only thing I couldn't buy with a check, Mercy." He finally turned, his steel-gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Now, Emily Carter, I am going to give you a choice. You can walk back to your old life with your debts cleared, or you can stay and help me protect the only thing I have left." The silence of the penthouse was heavier than the storm that had brought them together, a stillness that seemed to vibrate with the sheer power Lorenzo DeLuca wielded from this height. Emily stood near the elevator, her sneakers feeling out of place on the polished marble floors that reflected the sprawling, glittering grid of Chicago like a dark mirror. Lorenzo stepped away from the window, his movements possessing a predatory grace that the homeless man in the rain had only hinted at. He walked toward a side door, gesturing for her to follow. Inside was a medical suite that put the city's best hospitals to shame, a room filled with state-of-the-art monitors and soft, amber lighting where Giovanna lay resting. "The doctors call it a progressive neurological decline," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp as he stood by his mother's bedside. "They see a patient. They see a case to be managed with pills and sterile hands. But she hasn't eaten a full meal or spoken a coherent sentence in weeks. Not until that night in your apartment." He turned to Emily, the steel in his eyes flickering with a vulnerability he clearly wasn't used to showing. "She's been calling for you, Emily. She thinks you're a ghost, or perhaps an angel from her youth. She won't take her medication from the nurses I pay 6 figures. She won't even let them touch her." Emily walked to the bed, her nurse's instincts overriding her fear of the man standing behind her. She reached out and gently took Giovanna's hand. The older woman's eyes fluttered open, a faint, recognition-filled smile touching her lips as she whispered a name in Italian. "I don't just own half the city, Emily. I protect it," Lorenzo said, moving to stand directly behind her, his shadow enveloping her. "But I cannot protect her from this. I need someone she trusts. Someone whose heart isn't for sale." He leaned in, his presence overwhelming. "Stay here. Care for her. I will provide everything your mother needs, the best surgeons, the experimental treatments, a life where you never have to count pennies again. All I ask is that you be the warm hand she remembers." Emily looked from the frail woman to the man who could crush her with a word, realizing the miracle at the hospital had been a down payment on her soul. The choice was an illusion. To save her mother, she had to become a part of his world. The transition into the DeLuca household felt less like a new job and more like a silent induction into a fortress. Within 48 hours, Emily's world had been dismantled and reconstructed in marble and steel. Her cramped apartment and the counting of pennies were gone, replaced by a suite in the DeLuca estate that was larger than her entire previous home. But as she stood on the balcony overlooking the manicured grounds, she realized that every luxury came with a shadow. Men with earpieces moved like ghosts through the hallways, and the air held a permanent, metallic chill of guarded secrets. The work itself was the only thing that felt real. Emily spent her days at Giovanna's side, using the same warm hand that had saved the woman in the dark to navigate the complexities of her declining health. She was a bridge between the sterile world of medicine and the fierce, protective love of a son who didn't know how to be soft. Lorenzo appeared often, usually late at night when the rest of the city was asleep. He would stand in the doorway, the charcoal lines of his suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the dim light, watching Emily care for his mother with an expression that sat somewhere between gratitude and a deep, simmering possessiveness. "You look different in this light," Lorenzo remarked one evening, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He walked toward her, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain clinging to him. "The hunger is gone from your eyes, Emily. But you still look like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop." "In your world, Lorenzo, the other shoe is usually a heavy one," Emily replied, not looking away from the pulse she was measuring on Giovanna's wrist. He leaned in, his presence an overwhelming force that made the expansive room feel small again. "You are under my protection now," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "That means your mother gets the best surgeons in the country. It means you never have to worry about a bill again. But it also means my enemies know your name." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear with surprising gentleness. "Being close to me is the safest and most dangerous place in Chicago. Remember that." As he walked away, leaving her in the silence of the high-tech medical suite, Emily looked down at her hands. They were no longer shaking from cold or hunger, but from the realization that she had traded her struggle for a gilded cage. She had saved a king, and in return, he had made her a part of his war. The college girl who counted pennies was gone. In her place was a woman navigating a world of blood and silk, bound to a man who owned half the city and intended to keep the other half, including her, under his watch.